Hello, and welcome to Audio Recording 101. Today, we're going to talk about EQ. EQ is a term that we hear all the time in audio production. If something doesn't quite sound right, the first thing that most audio engineers suggest is to look at the EQ. Now, what is EQ? That's a complicated question. EQ is short for equalization, which is a term coined way back in the depths of audio history that was originally intended to use to balance a sound. So, say if there were too many low frequencies, you could equalize the high frequencies so that they would be equal. However, creative audio engineers from the depths of history to the present day have used this in a much more creative manner to emphasize high end in a track, bring out some of the mid-range, to deal with problems in the sound, or to completely transform something from its original intended purpose to something completely new. EQ is also known as filtering because an equalizer is almost always a filter of some kind. Now, there are several types of filter that we can use. There are low-pass filters, high-pass filters, band-pass filters, and some other more esoteric types. A high-pass filter is a very commonly used tool which is available on most digital equalizers and lots of hardware equalizers as well. This is quite often used, as the name suggests, to only allow the high frequencies to pass through. This is usually used to reduce subsonic rumble and excessive bass frequencies in tracks where this is not only unnecessary, but could cause damage or confusion in an overall track. Some mixing desks have a button that would engage a high-pass filter at a fixed frequency, commonly around about 100 Hz. Some mixing desks have preamps with a more complicated system that can choose between set frequencies. For instance, some Neve preamps can use 50 Hz, 80 Hz, 160 Hz, and some preamps have a more variable, from 0 Hz all the way up to ranges in the region of 500 Hz or more. In digital equalizers, this can commonly go from 0 Hz all the way up to the top of the audio spectrum, so it can be used very creatively. The main question used with a high-pass filter is, how much of the original low end do we want to keep? And this is something where if we look at the style of instrument, if it was say a bass guitar, we would likely want to keep most of the low end, so we may only cut below 50 Hz or 40 Hz depending on the style of the track and whether we want to keep the really low parts of the track. Whereas if it was something that was really high pitched, like say a tambourine, we may want to cut as high as 500 Hz or even more. A low-pass filter is often used on instruments where there is excessive high-end material that we just don't want. A good example of this is distorted electric guitars, where quite often there may be noise above, say, 12 kHz or 10 kHz that is negatively affecting an overall song that can be removed and still left with the rest of the signal which we actually wanted to keep. This can also be used as an effective denoiser. If there is excessive high-end frequency in a track that is just not necessary, an easy way to remove this is to just use a low-pass filter. When we use the term EQ, we most often think of a band filter. What the band filter does is it can increase or reduce the audio around a certain frequency, not just that frequency, but all the frequencies around that, based on how that band filter is designed. If we want to increase a certain aspect of a track's tone, then we may want to use a broad filter, because this may increase the frequencies around where we're looking for without introducing a ringing effect. This is quite often one of the most problematic parts of using a narrow band. Narrow bands, if you increase them, will give you a certain ringing sound because only a certain select few frequencies can be boosted or cut. And if boosted, they come across with a resonant tone which can be very negative indeed. Conversely, If there is a problem ringing sound already in your audio, an easy way to fix this is to use a very narrow band EQ and use that band as soon as you find exactly where that tone is. If you reduce the amount of level there is in your track, that should try and reduce that ring with very little collateral damage on the other frequencies around it. Digital EQs, such as parametric EQs, usually have a very broad, very open way of working, but this can lead to confusion if you are not particularly comfortable with using a parametric EQ. Because there are so many controls, you can change the bandwidth, you can change the amount, and you can graphically see how specific or how broad each filter is. However, with vintage EQs that you might use on an analog desk, they may be more limiting in their way of working because they only work at certain frequency bands, and they may be quite a lot more gentle than you want them to be. To take two examples, a Neve EQ is commonly a very broad, very described as musical EQ, described as such because of its wide frequency bands, which means it doesn't affect the audio too much when you boost or cut. And one quirk of Neve EQs traditionally is that as you increase the bands, the bandwidth becomes more narrow, so if you want to be very specific with an EQ band, you have to be more and more aggressive with said EQ, whereas a very gentle lift or cut can be very wide, very gentle sounding. Whereas an SSL EQ, for example, has much more specific controls. It has more knobs, which means that you are more free to do what you want with it, but it's a much more aggressive sounding EQ because it's designed to be more surgical, which means that you can correct problems much easier within a mix, but using this EQ may sound a little more obvious to the listener. One thing worth noting is that an equalizer or a filter can only affect frequencies which already exist. This means that if you have a very simple sound like, say, a sine wave, there is very little that an equalizer can do to affect this, because the frequencies were not there to be manipulated. However, if you had a frequency range that was much more like white noise, say a snare drum or a tambourine or a distorted guitar, something with a lot of frequency information, then an EQ is usually much more appropriate to the task and can be used to affect things as necessary. That concludes our brief overview of equalization. If you would like to learn more, please leave a comment in the section below and ask what you would like to be hearing about, and we will try and cover that topic for you. In the next episode in this series, we'll be talking about a brief overview of compression. Thank you for watching, and please hit the subscribe button if you found this useful, and watch one of the videos posted at the side of me here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.